Friends, thank you for being here today. On January 21st, 2026, in a private meeting room at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, an event occurred that most of the world viewed as a standard diplomatic photo opportunity. President Donald Trump sat down with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. The meeting lasted exactly 47 minutes. When they emerged, there were smiles, handshakes, and an announcement regarding a framework for a future deal on Greenland. The press took their photos, the market shrugged, and the news cycle prepared to move on. However, 3,000 miles away in Brussels, inside the chambers of the European Parliament, the reaction was not one of relief, but of unprecedented retaliation. While the cameras flashed in Switzerland, European legislators were holding an emergency session that would fundamentally reshape global trade and geopolitics for the next decade. In a move that largely escaped the immediate headlines, the European Union officially suspended the Agreement on Reciprocal Fair and Balanced Trade with the United States. This was not a minor bureaucratic delay. It was the complete freezing of a trade relationship worth $1.7 trillion annually. To put that figure into perspective, it is an economy larger than that of Russia and Australia combined. It represents $4.4 billion changing hands between America and Europe every single day. And it stopped. It did not stop because of a recession or a currency crisis or a disagreement over automobile tariffs. It stopped because of a diplomatic standoff concerning an island covered in ice with a population smaller than many rural American counties, Greenland. The narrative currently being offered by mainstream outlets suggests that the framework announced in Davos was a victory for Arctic security. The reality, however, is far more complex and far more precarious. What occurred in the weeks leading up to that meeting was the closest the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, has come to a complete fracture since its founding 75 years ago. This fracture was not caused by Russian aggression or Chinese expansionism, but by an internal dispute between the United States and its oldest allies. And while Washington and Brussels were locked in this high-stakes diplomatic standoff, risking the economic architecture of the Western world, another power was watching with intense interest, Beijing. What has transpired is exactly what Chinese strategic planners have been waiting for, not a military defeat of the West, but a fragmentation of the Western alliance from within. Today, we must look past the headlines and analyze the mechanics of this event. We need to understand the secret negotiations, the specific threats that were exchanged behind closed doors, and why this situation is not merely about real estate or ego. It is about the end of the post-World War II order, the security of the American economy, and the future of global power. To understand the severity of this crisis, we must first answer the question that few seem to be addressing with sufficient depth. Why is the United States willing to risk a 75-year alliance over an island of 57,000 people? The answer lies in the harsh realities of geology and geography. This is not a matter of purchasing territory for the sake of expansion. It is a matter of securing the raw materials that define modern economic and military power. Beneath Greenland's ice sheet, geologists have identified deposits of rare earth elements estimated to be worth $1.5 trillion. These minerals are not merely valuable. They are existential. They are the essential components for everything, from the guidance systems in our missiles, to the batteries in our electric vehicles, the magnets in wind turbines, and the circuitry in our smartphones. Currently, the People's Republic of China controls approximately 70% of global rare earth production. This monopoly grants Beijing a stranglehold on the supply chain of the 21st century. The United States defense industrial base is uncomfortably dependent on Chinese materials to build American military hardware. Greenland represents the only viable immediate alternative to this dependency. The Kvanefjeld deposit in southern Greenland alone contains an estimated 2.9 million tons of rare earth oxides. If developed, the single site could supply 15% of global demand, effectively breaking China's monopoly and securing American independence for critical defense materials. Furthermore, we must consider the geography. Greenland sits at the intersection of North America, Europe, and the Arctic Ocean. As we observe the undeniable reality of receding sea ice, the Arctic is transforming from a frozen barrier into a new maritime frontier. New shipping routes are opening that reduce transit times between Asia and Europe by 40%. The Northern Sea Route, which hugs the Russian coast, cuts the distance from Shanghai to Rotterdam by 3,000 nautical miles compared to the traditional route through the Suez Canal. At current shipping costs, this saves approximately $1 million per voyage for a large container ship. Russia is already exploiting these routes. China, despite being 4,800 miles from the Arctic Circle, declared itself a near-Arctic state in 2018, a claim that is geographically absurd but strategically telling. Beijing does not care about geography, they care about access. They have attempted to buy old naval bases in Greenland and finance airports, only to be blocked by American intervention. From the perspective of the White House, securing Greenland is not optional. It also houses the Patuxent Space Base, formerly Thule Air Base, located 750 miles north of the Arctic Circle. This base is the home of the 21st Space Wing and operates the early warning radar systems that would detect any incoming ballistic missile strike from Russia or China. It is the eyes of American missile defense. While the U.S. operates this base under a 1951 treaty, the ultimate sovereignty belongs to Denmark. The fear in Washington is that as Greenland moves toward independence and as Chinese investment offers become more lucrative, the security of this base could be compromised. I'd like to pause here for a moment and ask for your perspective. Given these strategic stakes, $1.5 trillion in critical minerals in the eyes of our missile defense, do you believe these assets justify risking the stability of the NATO alliance? Or is the unity of the West more valuable than any single territory? I'm genuinely curious to read your thoughts on this trade-off in the comments below. While the strategic value of Greenland is undeniable, the method by which the administration attempted to secure these interests triggered a diplomatic crisis of historic proportions. On January 7, 2026, during a press conference at Mar-a-Lago, the situation escalated from a policy goal to an international incident. When asked about Greenland, President Trump stated, "We need Greenland for economic security, for military security. I'm not going to rule out using military force or economic force." The explicit threat of military force against a NATO ally, Denmark, sent shockwaves through European capitals. The reaction was immediate. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen responded within hours, stating that any attempt by any nation to use force against Danish territory would mean the immediate end of NATO as we know it. The president doubled down on January 17th, issuing a specific ultimatum. If 8 key European nations, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Germany, France, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom, did not publicly support negotiations on Greenland's future status within 30 days, the United States would impose 10% tariffs on all goods from these countries. This was not a symbolic threat. These 8 nations represent America's closest economic and military partners. Germany exports $127 billion in goods to the U.S. annually. The Netherlands exports $87 billion. The United Kingdom exports $61 billion. A 10% tariff would not only cost American consumers an estimated $45 billion in higher prices, but would also devastate European export sectors. The European response was unprecedented in its unity and severity. On January 19th, the foreign ministers of the 8 targeted nations issued a joint statement condemning the threat as incompatible with NATO obligations. More importantly, they drew a red line. The territorial integrity of member states is non-negotiable. They warned that, if such threats were carried out, they would be forced to reconsider their participation in alliance structures. In diplomatic terms, this was a threat to dissolve NATO. Germany, France, and the UK possessed the 3 largest economies and the most powerful militaries in Europe. If they were to exit the alliance structure, NATO would effectively cease to function as a global power. However, while the political rhetoric dominated the airwaves, the true casualty of this conflict was the economic architecture of the transatlantic relationship. Months prior, in August 2025, the US and the EU had signed the Agreement on Reciprocal Fair and Balanced Trade. This agreement was poised to create the largest free trade zone in human history, covering a combined market of 850 million people and a GDP of $45 trillion. It was designed to eliminate tariffs on 90% of goods, harmonize regulations, and serve as the democratic world's economic answer to China's Belt and Road Initiative. On January 21st, the same day as the Davos meeting, the European Parliament voted to suspend this agreement. The vote was 573 in favor, 42 against. The resolution suspended all ratification processes until the United States unequivocally renounced the use of force against EU member states. Furthermore, the Parliament authorized the preparation of retaliatory tariffs on $150 billion of American goods. These targets were chosen with surgical political precision: bourbon whiskey from Kentucky, corn from Iowa, wheat from Kansas. The goal was to inflict maximum political pain on key American constituencies. But the most alarming aspect of the resolution was a clause authorizing the European Commission to begin formal consultations with China on a potential comprehensive trade agreement. This was the ultimate leverage, threatening to pivot the European economy toward Beijing if Washington continued its coercive tactics. The suspension of the UN-STO-EU deal froze a $1.7 trillion annual trade relationship. It halted an agreement that was projected to add $550 billion to the global economy over 5 years. But beyond the trade numbers, it placed at risk the $4.7 trillion in mutual foreign direct investment, FDI. American companies have $2.5 trillion invested in Europe. European companies have $2.2 trillion invested here. These investments, factories, distribution centers, research labs, rely on political stability. When that stability fractures, capital flight begins. This brings us back to the Davos meeting on January 21st. The framework, announced by President Trump and Secretary General Rutte, was presented as a victory. but a close analysis reveals it was a necessary exercise in damage control. The deal effectively walked back the brinkmanship of the previous weeks. Based on the joint statement and subsequent reporting from NATO officials, the framework contains several key components that define the new status quo. First, and most importantly, the United States formally renounced the use of military force regarding Greenland. The statement affirmed a commitment to the territorial integrity of all NATO member states, a diplomatic necessity to prevent the 8 European nations from walking away from the alliance. Second, the tariff threats were quietly withdrawn. The White House issued a statement post-meeting that the tariff review had been postponed, which in diplomatic parlance often means canceled. Third, the framework established the NATO Arctic Security Initiative. This is the substantive core of the agreement. It commits the U.S., Canada, Denmark, Norway, and Iceland to coordinate on Arctic defense and, crucially, to develop rare earth mining in Greenland under a partnership model. This is the distinction that matters. The U.S. did not buy Greenland. It did not gain sovereignty. Instead, it secured an agreement where NATO countries will invest in developing Greenland's resources, and the minerals will be shared among alliance members. Fourth, the deal includes the Golden Dome Initiative, a proposed $18 billion missile defense installation in northern Greenland to complement the existing Thule radar. However, the critical concession lies in the Greenlandic Consent Clause. The framework explicitly states that all security and mining arrangements are subject to the approval of Greenland's local government. This gives a veto power to the 57,000 residents of the island. It acknowledges the reality that Greenland is moving toward independence. A referendum is scheduled for 2028, and attempts to lock in security arrangements before that political shift occurs. While President Trump framed this as achieving his goals without compromising sovereignty, the reality is that the U.S. accepted a partnership role rather than the ownership role initially demanded. It was a compromise, born of necessity, intended to stop the bleeding within the alliance. However, to fully appreciate the gravity of this framework, and to understand why the United States was pushed to such desperate measures that it risked breaking the alliance, we must look beyond the diplomatic maneuvering. We must look at what is happening in the silence of the high north and what military strategists call the invisible war beneath the ice. The desperation in Washington was not born of paranoia, but of a rapidly deteriorating security picture that the public rarely sees. In the 6 months leading up to the Davos meeting, American intelligence services detected a sharp increase in activity that fundamentally threatened the North American continent. Russian naval forces have been deploying their new class of nuclear-powered unmanned underwater vehicles, the Poseidon class, which are designed to evade traditional sonar and deliver catastrophic payloads to coastal cities. These assets use the deep waters of the Arctic as a staging ground, hidden under the ice cap, where satellite surveillance is blind. More concerning to the Pentagon, however, has been the dual-use activity of Chinese research vessels. Ships like the Shuilong 2 have been systematically mapping the Arctic seafloor. While officially conducting climate research, these vessels are gathering the bathymetric data required for submarine warfare. They are mapping the hiding spots, the thermal layers, and the transit routes that Chinese submarines would need to access the North Atlantic unnoticed. This brings us to the strategic nightmare known as the GIUK Gap, the line running from Greenland to Iceland to the United Kingdom. For decades, this was the choke point where NATO could track and bottle up Soviet submarines. But as the ice retreats and technology advances, that gap is widening. If Greenland were to drift into neutrality, or worse, into a sphere of Chinese influence where Beijing could establish listening posts or refueling stations under commercial guises, the gap would become a highway. The entire eastern seaboard of the United States would be exposed to undetectable underwater threats. This is why the president was willing to threaten economic warfare against allies. In the calculus of the Situation Room, the risk of offending Denmark paled in comparison to the risk of losing the ability to detect a nuclear first strike. The Golden Dome Initiative, mentioned in the framework, is not just a radar upgrade. It is a desperate attempt to plug this hole in the shield before it is too late. There is also a profound historical echo here that is impossible to ignore for anyone who has studied the trajectory of the 20th century. We are witnessing a moment that eerily mirrors the Suez Crisis of 1956, but in reverse. In 1956, the United Kingdom and France, fading imperial powers, attempted to seize control of the Suez Canal to secure their economic lifelines. The United States, asserting its new dominance, forced them to withdraw by threatening to crash the British pound. It was a brutal humiliation that signaled the end of European imperial power and the solidification of American hegemony. Washington dictated the terms, the Allies obeyed. 70 years later, we have just watched the inverse. The United States attempted to assert control over a strategic waterway and territory. But this time, the middle powers of Europe, Germany, France, the UK, and the Nordics, stood firm. They did not back down. They threatened economic retaliation, they leveraged their collective market power, and they forced the American president to accept a compromise. For those of you watching who remember the Cold War era, or perhaps even studied the Suez Crisis, I would value your historical perspective here. Do you agree with this parallel? Are we witnessing a reverse Suez moment where American unilateralism is finally checked by its own allies? Please share your insights in the discussion section. This is a watershed moment. It signals that the era of unilateral American dictate within the Western alliance is effectively over. The Greenland crisis has revealed that while the U.S. remains the indispensable military power, it can no longer command the economic obedience of its partners. Europe has realized that it possesses its own form of leverage, the ability to say a no, and the economic mass to make it stick. This shift is precisely what makes the situation so dangerous. An alliance of equals is harder to manage than an alliance of followers. It requires constant negotiation, patience, and shared vision, qualities that are in short supply in modern politics. By forcing this confrontation, Washington may have secured a radar station, but it has accelerated the transition to a multipolar West, where consensus is elusive and reaction times are slow. And in a world of hypersonic missiles and AI-driven warfare, slowness can be fatal. Yet, while the West scrambled to repair the cracks in its alliance, Beijing moved to widen them. The true winner of the Greenland crisis was neither the United States nor Europe, but the People's Republic of China. China's strategy in this century is not defined by direct military confrontation, which would be catastrophic, but by strategic patience. A 2021 report from a research institute affiliated with the Chinese Communist Party, titled Long-Term Competition with the United States, argues that China should wait for internal contradictions in the American alliance system to deepen. The Greenland crisis was a textbook example of these contradictions manifesting. On January 22nd, the day after the Davos announcement, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs signaled its intent. A spokesperson stated that China remains committed to cooperation with all Arctic nations and peoples. The inclusion of the word peoples was a deliberate diplomatic signal to the indigenous population of Greenland that China views them as a distinct partner, regardless of Copenhagen or Washington. 3 days later, the state-owned China Northern Rare Earth Group announced the Rare Earth Partnership Initiative. This program offers technical assistance and low-interest financing to any country wishing to develop mining capabilities. It is effectively a Belt and Road initiative for critical minerals, designed to court nations like Greenland that possess resources but lack capital. More significantly, the rift between the US and Europe provided Beijing with a diplomatic opening. When the European Parliament authorized talks with China following the suspension of the US trade deal, they handed Beijing leverage. Preliminary discussions began on January 26th. While a full EU-China pivot is unlikely in the immediate term, the mere existence of these talks undermines the US strategy of a united front against Chinese economic practices. European leaders are now keenly aware that American leadership can be volatile. This drives the continent toward strategic autonomy, the development of independent defense and economic capabilities. Every step Europe takes toward autonomy is a step away from reliance on Washington. For China, a divided West is a manageable West. If NATO cannot agree on the status of its own territories, it certainly cannot coordinate an effective response to a crisis in the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea. So, what does this geopolitical maneuvering mean for us here at home? Why should the average American concerned with their retirement, their savings, and their country's future care about a suspended trade deal or a mine in the Arctic? First, there's the immediate impact on the cost of living. The suspension of the US-EU trade deal means that tariffs which were set to be eliminated will remain in place. The costs of European imports, from industrial machinery to consumer goods, will not decrease. Furthermore, American exporters, particularly in the agricultural and manufacturing sectors, have lost the opportunity to access a friction-free market of 450 million consumers. This represents lost growth and lost potential for American businesses. Second, the instability of the alliance affects investment portfolios. The $4.7 trillion in mutual investment is the bedrock of the transatlantic economy. When corporate boards perceive political risk, they pause investment, they delay the construction of new factories, they hold back on hiring. This hesitation creates a drag on the economy that eventually impacts stock prices and 401k returns. Third, there's the cost of national security. If NATO weakens, or if European nations feel compelled to build their own independent defense structures, the burden of global security falls disproportionately on the American taxpayer. We are already seeing the costs of a more volatile world in our defense budgets. A fractured alliance is an expensive alliance. Finally, there's the issue of strategic vulnerability. The entire premise of the Greenland maneuver was to secure rare earth minerals and break dependence on China. While the Davos framework sets up a partnership to do this, the delay and the diplomatic friction have slowed the process. As long as we remain dependent on Chinese supply chains for our advanced technology and defense systems, we are vulnerable. China has demonstrated a willingness to use economic coercion to achieve political goals. By alienating our allies, we make it harder to build the alternative supply chains we desperately need. We stand now at a crossroads. The crisis of January 2026 has been diffused, but the underlying tensions remain. The framework is a temporary fix, a patch on a leaking vessel. There are 3 potential paths forward from this moment. The first is reconciliation. This would require a concerted effort by Washington and Brussels to rebuild trust, restart trade negotiations, and treat the Arctic Security Initiative as a genuine partnership. It requires leadership that prioritizes long-term alliance stability over short-term leverage. The second path is muddling through. This is the most likely immediate outcome. The trade deal remains frozen. Security cooperation continues, but at a lower level of trust. The relationship becomes transactional. We are partners when it suits us, and competitors when it doesn't. This state of affairs is inherently unstable, leaving the alliance vulnerable to the next crisis. The third path is fracture. If another dispute arises, perhaps over Taiwan or Ukraine or trade tariffs, and the same pattern of threats and coercion is repeated, the center may not hold. European nations have already drafted the contingency plans for a post-NATO world. They have looked over the precipice, and they know what it looks like. Which of these 3 paths do you think is the most realistic outcome for the next decade? Will we find a way to reconcile? Will we just muddle through? Or are we heading toward a fracture? Let me know which scenario you see playing out. The Greenland crisis served as a stress test for the Western alliance, and the results were alarming. The structure held, but the cracks are visible to everyone, especially our adversaries. In conclusion, friends, we must recognize that the era of automatic alliance unity is over. The relationships that guaranteed American security and prosperity for 3/4 of a century require maintenance, respect, and mutual benefit. They cannot be taken for granted, nor can they be managed through coercion without severe economic consequences. The freezing of a $1.7 trillion trade alliance is a high price to pay for a lesson in diplomacy. We must hope that it is a lesson learned, because as the ice melts in the Arctic and the geopolitical landscape shifts, we will need our friends more than ever. The alternative is a world where the West is divided, and the rising powers of the East are free to set the terms of the future. If you found this analysis valuable and want to stay ahead of these geopolitical shifts, please consider subscribing. But more importantly, share this discussion with someone who appreciates the deeper context behind the headlines. Thank you for your time and your attention to these critical matters.